I get up, no, can't deny it.
A než se vyvine ponorka, tak to může být docela fajn.
Už jsme asi online, pokládám. Skvělý, tak jo. So, hi guys, good evening everyone. Thanks for joining us for this amazing special virtual event. My name is Petr Juránek and I am founder of Startup Disrupt. And we are really happy that you join us for this. I think that really like the actual topic, coronavirus, solidarity, security and policy. And because we are trying to give you the best added value, the highest added value as we can, we decided to invite for this debate two amazing gentlemen. The first is Petr Pavel, who is a retired Army general, former chairman of NATO Military Committee, and really experienced guy in terms of army and as well some social projects, which we'll talk about later. And the moderator for today's debate, Petr Bohacek, who is the researcher on space policy, transatlantic relations and global security. And it wouldn't be possible for us to organize events like this without our partner sponsors and people who are supporting us on this journey, from Czech Invest, Google, Lagardère, Philip Morris, and many others. If you have any questions regarding to this debate, please don't hesitate and go to Slido. And if you'll use the code SDP, like Startup Disrupt Prague, you can ask questions. And the moderator, Petr Bohacek, will have the access and bring the top ones and discuss with the general. So please, if you have any questions, jump on Slido and ask them. And right now, Peter, the stage is yours, and enjoy today's debate.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining us and finding time during these interesting times. And it's really an honor to me to lead this discussion with General Petr Pavel. And we will talk, as said, about solidarity, security, and policy in light of the coronavirus epidemic. Or rather pandemic, I should say. And we really stick to these three words: solidarity, security, and policy, meaning mainly defense and foreign policy, given General's experiences. And we'll start with solidarity. General, if I could maybe start with your past. Obviously, you have been through many experiences, many crises, but most recently, you have been the chairman of the NATO Military Committee. So I would maybe start asking you, you must have gone through some crisis management and crisis situations. Is there anything you would say is similar, or any lessons learned, or any experiences that you could talk about dealing with crisis as a chairman of military of NATO Military Committee that we could maybe take as valuable now during the coronavirus pandemic?
Thank you, Petr, and good evening to all of you. It's my great pleasure. I cannot promise you will get the best added value, but I can promise I will do my best. So to start with the description of the crisis that we have today, it is to some kind different from many others we went through before. But at the same time, there are common features. Crisis actually is the crisis requires specific measures, requires some restrictions, but also requires from all of us to go through it with a calm mind. That means that we always have to consider the crisis in the context. What we see today is a kind of bringing the crisis to an isolation, seeing it as a kind of apocalypse coming on us from nowhere. We are facing day by day, 24 hours a day news from different sorts of media depicting a number of infected, number of deaths. We are facing news from hospitals where tired medical staff is very hardly taking numbers of infected people, some of them very heavily. We also face numbers from statistics, how many people died in different countries, and it really looks like a war. But at the same time, if we bring this coronavirus crisis to the context, and we simply take a number of casualties, we will very quickly realize that this crisis is no different from every year flu epidemics. It is no different from conflicts that are still ongoing. It is no different from other diseases like cancer and heart attacks. It's even not different from casualties that we suffer during our transport on the roads. So obviously it is different. It requires different tools, different approaches, but at the same time, it is not a kind of apocalypse that would or should paralyze us. We simply have to handle it with proper means and stay calm and go on, because life goes on. We have to come back to normal as soon as possible. And we simply have to focus on overcoming the crisis and stay mentally healthy.
All right, great. Well, we have seen many examples of people doing very, let's say, inspiring things in despite this crisis. We have seen, great amounts of solidarity, civil society engagement, people just helping each other. Do you think these are key factors for the society to handle with any crisis, whether it's military, non-military, health crisis? And what would you say are the most important things society can show during crisis? Is it resilience, solidarity, social cohesion, all of them? Which one do you think is the most important? Which one is the one that you have maybe seen the most?
I would say the three qualities you have mentioned are all present, and they are probably the most important. What is obvious that in any crisis, and especially this one, to stay with crisis we have, we always see some good and bad things to pop up. We normally don't see them because in normal life, especially when things go well, and we saw the economy going pretty well in a number of countries, and the world, especially in Europe, or most part of Europe, was peaceful and calm. So in such an environment, we will not see too much solidarity, too much will for cooperation. But when hardships come to our lives, we suddenly see how many people are willing to assist, how many people are willing to get rid of their own comfort and to do something meaningful, how many people are much more responsible than we believed. So I would say these are very important features that we have witnessed during this crisis, them for good times to come.
Well, you mentioned that there's many people that are active, that the civil society, the private businesses, that people in general, citizens themselves, are taking in their hands and helping each other and really taking care of their closed one and just the public in general. But let me turn to the other aspect of how a society is dealing with the crisis, and that is a leadership, whether it's official, political, governmental leadership. What do you think, what type of leadership does a crisis require? do we need to sort of go and follow, restrictions and really, empower a higher authority in times of crisis, or how do we balance it with, being keeping democratic processes and making sure that everything is done according to rule of law, and that we do not succumb to maybe calls for higher authority?
Well, what I would probably put to the first place is leadership in a crisis has to be a little bit different from peaceful times. In peacetime, we politicians will focus on their popularity, on perception by the public, because there will be next elections. But when it comes to crisis, I personally believe that what we all should focus on, regardless from which political party or movement do we come, that the crisis affects all of us, regardless if we are liberals or conservatives, or left-wing, right-wing, or even extremists. And especially virus doesn't distinguish between political preferences. What we have seen, unfortunately, at least from the beginning, not only in our country but also in other countries, is that number of politicians kept going in the same populistic way, and were primarily focused on their own visibility instead of problem solution. So what I would stress that for any crisis, what we need is transparent leadership, leadership by example, leadership that is civil enough to be understood by everyone, and that is free from political benefits, at least for the duration of the crisis. Because I think if a leader focuses on the resolution of a crisis, the success with voters would come in itself. So it doesn't have to be solved day by day, but it will pop up from the action, and action has to be seen as problem solving, not adding political preferences.
Mm-hmm. Just so we are not talking about the ills of bad political leadership during crisis, could you maybe name or think of any good examples that you've seen around of good leadership, of good political government leadership, or any actors that you think really stood up to the crisis well and could be sort of put as an example?
Well, if I look around for good examples of leadership, I would probably stress more expert than political level. And what we have seen from especially epidemiologists from all around the world, they usually were very moderate, very sober in their evaluation of situation. They were also very clear in talking about what are the options. Sometimes probably too open in terms of delivering messages that were not always positive, but that's exactly what's necessary, because in times of crisis, people don't need to hear only good news, but what is a real situation, because then they are able to face it. Otherwise, they would probably fall into expectations that may not be fulfilled in the end. So I think in times of crisis, it's good to give the word to the experts. And for the politicians, it's obviously important to pick up good experts and then stick to their advice.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's something that's going to stick with us, maybe even after the crisis? Because this is not the only crisis that we're dealing with, but the issue you mentioned of people and politicians not really listening to the experts and scientists also links to the issue of climate crisis and climate change. That's a similar area where people say we're not listening to experts, we're not listening to scientists. Do you think there are similarities, and do you maybe hope that we are going to take some lessons from this health crisis and carry them to the way how we deal with the climate crisis?
I think this dilemma of expert and political level will always be with us. It's normal in democratic societies. Politicians would argue that they and only they bear political responsibility, and they are elected. That's absolutely true. But on the other hand, if they do not listen to the experts and listen only to public opinion, their decisions may be utterly wrong. So I believe that for every politician, it's very useful when they listen to the experts, as many as possible, when they put a lot of emphasis on their advice, and then pick up best option and communicate it well to the public and take responsibility for political decision. But what we have seen, not always, but in several occasions, where the decisions taken by politicians which were based not on expert advice, but on public expectation. So focusing on what people would like to hear will not solve the crisis. And it's exactly that kind of political responsibility of politicians to tell people even very unpleasant truth, if it is for the sake of resolution of the crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very common theme these times when we have more and more politicians that are pretty much repeating what they see on the lips of their voters instead of being responsible. Well, but I wanted to sort of move on, and we started with talking about your past as a chairman of the NATO Military Committee. When you had a lot of responsibilities as a public person, as a military person. Now you are no longer in a military or government, you are a private person, but it seems that you never let down of those responsibilities, and you yourself were very active in the pandemic as well, with launching your project, raising over 1 million crowns. Project called Spolu Silnější, or Together Stronger. So I wanted to ask you about what has this project sort of showed you about the society, about the people, about our ability as the Czech Republic to deal with the crisis and with challenges.
Well, let me start from individual people that were in fact my inspiration. What we have seen in Czech Republic was slightly different from other countries in terms of the production of protective gear. And it's partially because we are used to improvise in times of deficiencies, but it is also based on the fact that people are used to take responsibility for themselves, not only to rely on someone else or on the government. So when we were facing from the very beginning lack of all this protective gear, people started producing face masks themselves. And not only ordinary people, but also small companies, bigger companies, even academic universities started thinking how they can overcome the shortages. And suddenly, what we have seen was the flood of different initiatives coming from people who simply didn't want to sit back and wait, and started doing something what simply made sense for them. And there were individuals who produced first tens, then hundreds of face masks and started delivering them to their neighborhood. Then other people started providing these things to what is now very modern to say people in frontline. All those medical staffs, police, firefighters, the military, emergency people who were facing day by day the epidemics. And then there were a number of people who were not able to produce face masks or to come up with innovative ventilators or any other sophisticated equipments, but still wanted to do something. And they started assisting in a way that were fit to their capabilities. They started delivering assistance by their own cars. They started assisting elderly people, doing the shopping for them, delivery of medicaments, and many other services. And of course, I was frustrated that I am not good enough in producing face masks. So I had to think about something else. And I saw some opportunity in addressing people of the same deficiency as my own, but still willing to assist and assist by financial means. And we came up with my colleagues with the initiative that was based on a very simple statement: let's help to those who are helping. And we announced the initiatives 2 weeks ago, and within these 2 weeks, donors and by vast majority small donors sent altogether more than 1 million Czech crowns, which we very promptly delivered to today 14, 15 projects. And these projects stem from production of the masks through delivery of food to provision of food to those who are in a difficult social situation, through assistance to elderly people, financing some charity activities. And overall, I believe that it is one piece of the puzzle. It's definitely not the crucial initiative, but it's one of many that will make us in the end stronger, because it demonstrates the strength of civil society.
That's really wonderful. And what do you think are going to be plans ahead? Are you now only helping those who are helping, and are you planning on maybe enlarging the scope of your fundraising goals, or is there any way that you guys are looking forward to what could be the next steps with your initiative?
Well, as I mentioned, the first idea behind this initiative was to help those who are helping, and to allow them keeping their assistance for a longer time. Of course, the phase of I would say health crisis will end up one day, but we will have other crises coming out of this health crisis, and social tensions will arise. There will be a number of people who were not able to earn any money over a couple of months. They were totally dependent on their small businesses. And a number of these people, including single mothers and socially weak families, will get into difficulties. And the state simply cannot take care of everyone. State can provide a lot of assistance, but there will be still a lot of room for the initiatives that are coming from civil society and not from the state sector. So I believe there will be a lot of opportunities to continue our assistance even after the medical crisis is over.
Great. So for anyone who is listening, this is definitely a project worth investing into if you want to help others. So I wanted to move on to our other topic, our other axis of issues, which is linked to security. We started talking about these new security threats, not necessarily being linked to the hard security as we know it, to military. If we talk about climate change, if we talk about economic crisis, if we talk about migration crisis, and so on. So I wanted to maybe ask if what do you think will be the role of NATO and of militaries in general in handling crises in the future that are not inherently based on military power and are not solvable by military power?
Let me start by going a couple of years backwards in time. When I came to my position in NATO in 2015, it was shortly after the annexation of Crimea by Russia. We were talking about changing, fundamental change of security environment. And then by the major change, we meant changing nature of this security environment from purely military means to non-military or paramilitary means. So on one hand, we saw Russia more assertive, using not only their military power, but also using what we in the West call hybrid warfare. We may come to that later, but what was meant under hybrid warfare were all other non-military tools being used in coordination and strengthening each other, led by one single purpose. We also saw another phenomenon rising, and it was international terrorism, mostly motivated by extreme Islamist movements, so-called Islamic State, taking a lot of influence and a lot of territory in the Middle East. But we also saw rising China and China using much less their military power, but much more their soft power. Economic, financial, scientific, educational, technological, and many others. Right now, what we see is another dimension of this complicated security environment, which is caused by nature itself, provided that the virus comes from nature. But if it is COVID-19 or any other virus that may come later, it will be another dimension of security environment, and we see that this virus has affected the security environment probably more than all the hybrid warfare in the last couple of years. So we will have to extend security considerations by many other factors than just military power. Military power is still there and will be there for a long time. We don't see any withdrawal from focus on hard military power from Russia, China, and many other countries. But we will have to pay much more attention to those non-military security threats and risks. Number of them not even caused by humans, or at least not directly. We will see probably more pandemics. We'll probably see much more drought caused by the change of the climate. We talk about drought in Czech Republic in early spring. We'll see what comes up during the summer. And there will be a number of other factors that we will have to think about when talking about security.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned it that security is much more linked than to straight military big conflict, to big powers using economics, using disinformation, using other tools, rather than the direct military confrontation to exert their influence. Do you think, together with the pandemic, together with other non-military crises and security threats, this will be another point of pressure to lower direct defense spending and maybe focus the money and investment into, let's say, health sector to build up resilience, to build up a better education, to fight disinformation? Or do you think that there's going to be more of an increase in, let's say, defense spending because security is becoming more and more important?
I would say probably not necessarily to get into discussion of decreasing or increasing defense spending, but I would definitely support, let's look at security much more as the whole of government, whole of society issue. It's definitely not an issue for Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Interior. It is the issue for the whole government, the whole society. NATO is a political military organization that is focused mainly on a threat coming from military power. But increasingly, we will have to discuss both within NATO and European Union and UN and any other organization, what are these bridges between different ministries? How can we best tackle a crisis that requires contributions from a number of different sectors? For example, when we discussed in NATO security issues concerning Russia, it was definitely not just about counting divisions and aircraft and warships and missiles. It is also about economic strength. It is also about energy. It's also about demographics. It's about a number of other issues that we have to consider. And for that, we need more than highly qualified generals, political analysts. We need people who understand economics, who understand sociology, who understand psychology, people who understand environment and energy, and bring them all together and provide their expertise to come up with very complex solutions for complex problems. So I think it's probably premature to talk about level of defense spending, but it is not premature of talking on much more coordination, much more comprehensive evaluation of all the problems.
That's a very interesting point, that we need to, let's say, reconceptualize security as a whole government and whole society issue. But discussing global threats as the pandemic makes me want to ask you if maybe we should reconceptualize it and think about it more globally, and see if it's not just a whole government and whole society issue, but a whole, if it's an international issue, if we do have institutions internationally, globally, that are capable of dealing with this global threat. Do you think that we do have mechanisms of global cooperation and just global institutions that are able to tackle global threats like this pandemic?
We have a number of institutions. Some of them have a very good reputation, some a little bit worse, but at least we have the foundations to build on. We hear quite often voices against NATO, against the EU, even against the UN. But for the moment, we don't have any better alternative. So let's work with what we have, and let's try to improve it, adapt it to make them better, more modern, and responding to current needs and requirements. For example, when I come back to NATO, which I know a little bit better than the EU from internal procedures, we obviously can think to what extent to expand the scope for NATO. I spoke about it minutes ago, that we have to focus not just on military aspects, but on many others. And there are some good trends within NATO to embrace more aspects of security than just military. We have to think about how to bring closer together NATO and the EU, NATO, EU, and UN, because all of these institutions are unique in their own respect. They have unique tools that the other organizations don't have, or don't have so well developed. We have to find better ways how to get best out of each of these organizations and make them working to common benefit. Quite often, what we see is rather competition and institutional jealousy than will to smoothly cooperate.
You mentioned that we do have some institutions that we should focus on or emphasize that we need to make reforms or improve how they work. And when we talk about these things at the coronavirus time, obviously the institution that gets talked about the most is the World Health Organization, which is an organ of the United Nations. It's been frequently criticized recently from not only the United States, but also the other Western countries for being too, let's say, pro-Chinese and not being there to expose, let's say, Chinese approach or neglect or manipulation of data of the cases and so on. So here we sort of get to the issue of how is it possible to reform these institutions when they have to cater to those interests of the biggest countries, let's say, for example, China, because it's probably unthinkable that the World Health Organization would function and would have a director and have any power if China was against it. So doesn't this sort of put us in a situation where we do have international organizations, but just by having all these national interests clashing within them, they become, let's say, not as effective and maybe too late to react to some issues?
We will probably not be in a position to avoid all these negative effects because if these organizations are to be truly multilateral, then we will always have countries with competing interests. But what I would argue, it's always better to have them rather than fighting each other's interests without any framework, without any restrictions. We see a number of difficulties in getting into, for example, UN Security Council resolution, because 5 permanent members have their veto power. But still, would it be better not having UN Security Council or even not having United Nations or not having NATO, EU? So I see these organizations as a truly good platform for coordination, for exchange. And these organizations have their procedures, their structure, and despite all the difficulties, they eventually come to a decision that is leading to progress. So even with the WHO, I think it is worth of coming back to the issues mentioned by American President right after the crisis is over, because at this point it would be very unwise to cripple the organization that provides number of assistance to countries, especially those heavily affected. But at the same time, what we shouldn't allow would be celebrating the victory over the virus and forgetting all the problems that we were facing. So we definitely have to come back to it and look at the functioning of WHO. And I would say that the civilized way would be to have a session where we would raise all these problems, would come up with options how to mitigate the problems. And these ideally should result in adaptation of the processes and probably even structure of the organization to be better fit for the purpose for the next crisis.
Okay, it's sort of apparent to me that even during times of this pandemic, geopolitics does not sleep, and we obviously have geopolitics play still a very important role, whether if it's in the reactions about the WHO, but also because of the origin of the virus being China. There's been a lot of criticism of this being the Chinese virus. There's been a lot of sort of a fight over the more dominating narrative about the virus and its origins. We had a lot of, let's say, I don't feel like in a position to say disinformation or information, but let's say speculations about the origins of the virus, whether if it was engineered or whether if it's really animal origin. So what has this also exposed about the disinformation campaigns from Chinese side, from Russian side, about also the geopolitics behind it and how each side tries to use any crisis and any event to their advantage?
I think what we can observe that information is a weapon, and it always was a weapon, but with new technologies, it's even more powerful than any time before. There is nothing new on disinformation because it was with us from the origins of humankind, and it is only highly sophisticated today. It is widespread. It is so well developed that it's extremely difficult to distinguish disinformation from the truth. So it's quite normal that it has become a tool for everyone. It's not just a matter of Russia or China, because disinformation always was a tool of war fighting or the conflicts, or at least if we don't use the word disinformation, that sounds almost as a dirty word, but say some confusing messages, deception. It was always part of the war fighting. But disinformation today, especially when related to this coronavirus crisis, is much more harmful, because deception from China in the origins of that time epidemic in China caused problems of the global scope, because from what we learned from a number of studies so far, should China announce several weeks earlier that there was such a virus, then there wouldn't probably be a global pandemic. there would be some isolated cases, but probably not of that scope. It exposed China as a regime that cannot be trusted, as a regime that is used to deception, to disinformation, to concealing the facts, but also it has exposed China as a country that is ready to use to its own advantage any crisis, including this one. So on one hand, it shows China as a country that has a growing influence globally, but it also exposed China as it is, and it probably reduces some of the populations that we were used to hearing in the information domain.
Well, and I would add that it also exposed the amount of dependency of the West on Chinese manufacturing, especially in terms of personal protective equipment. We saw China very heavily taking advantage of sort of showing itself as a provider of these equipment and saving countries, whether it was in Italy or in the Czech Republic, by providing at high cost these protective personal equipment. But I wanted to continue with this to ask, with China being exposed as what it is, and their, let's say, malicious intents. Do you think it's going to follow up with some sort of attempts to decouple the dependency or the Western and US economies from the Chinese economy and manufacturing, and to maybe search for bigger independence in manufacturing, in some industrial capacities, because we see that this big economy is not reliable when it comes to a crisis?
I would probably use the word decoupling of economies, but what we will have to think about is, self-sufficiency in a number of items. What is quite normal is that in a globalized world, some production, especially production with low added value, and of course then offering a low margin for investors, will move where there is a cheaper labor force. But it also demonstrates the weakness of this globalization. And especially this crisis showed in very clear colors that when we are dependent on one provider, especially in such a low sophistication equipment like single-use protective masks, it's the same level of dangerous dependency as in sophisticated commodities, because it's killing people. So it's then not the question if it is a highly sophisticated main battle tank or a face mask. But what is quite striking, that industries in our countries, and I will focus on Czech Republic, we have a number of companies who are able producing face masks, but their production was so low that they were not able quickly multiply their production. So in the beginning, we had no other choice than to look for this equipment elsewhere. And if only country who were able to provide it in large numbers was China, then obviously it was the only option. But at the same time, we have to look at the politics behind, because I'm quite certain that after couple of weeks of the crisis, our companies were already in a position to provide sufficient number of this equipment, at least to our own country. But it was not so supported from the government, because government already made an agreement with China, which was agreed for some period of time, amount of money, amount of equipment. And it was much easier for the government to have one contractor than tens or hundreds of smaller contractors from our own country. What it shows to us for the future, that we have to think about keeping some even unsophisticated production at home, to have at least the foundation of that production that can be very quickly multiplied in numbers through simple organizational means, so that we are not reliant on any other country. Because it is quite clear that when it comes to crisis, every country would first serve their own population, and only then they will provide assistance to the others. And really to be dependent on something that simple as a face mask is simply hard to believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and would you maybe just a quick follow up on that? Would you say that we should deal with this on the country level, or maybe in our case on a European Union level? Because it's easily imagined that when it comes to maybe face masks, but also respirators and ventilators, every country might not be able to do all these things, but we might, as a community, based on values, share these tasks. Would something like that on the European level make sense to you as well?
It makes absolutely sense, and I would use one concrete example, and it's a technical university in Prague, where just a handful of enthusiastic people, students and professors, came up with the face mask and filter that were based on half mask for diving, but it was developed, certified within 1 week. And the level of protection was much higher than anything that was available on the market. And if this idea got support from the very beginning, not only support in assisting with the certification process, but also support in production with the large numbers, support with international relations and international contracts. Then, of course, this product would be available to a number of countries from the very beginning, because Technical University was willing to share know-how from the very beginning with a number of countries, and only because the idea got traction both in the EU and NATO. Within a very short time, they got requests from 25 different countries from a number of companies who were able to produce based on this shared license. So this is just one example, and I believe that there are many examples of that kind. So if there is a good coordination within, for example, EU and NATO, where a good idea gets immediately to those who can provide any assistance, because one country may be willing to offer a production line, another country would offer money or legal support or any other. It is called a contribution in kind. And by being able to bring all these contributions in kind together, being able to share it we are in a much better, much stronger position than a single country. It makes sense. So I think this example also should be not only noted, but learned as a lesson from this crisis, and probably serve as a model on which we will build coordination measures for next crisis to come.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned so many, let's say, non-government and non-political moves that came from the technical university. I know in the Czech Republic, there's been also Prussia Labs that 3D print face masks and ventilators, and there's been just so many reactions outside of the government. While we talked about how the government rather bought for maybe some political motivations cheap Chinese masks. And this kind of sort of serves as an intro to one of the questions from the audience that asks whether politics is not too deeply incorporated into our lives for the worst of it. And if you and the author asks if you would suggest to optimize it and prevent politicization of everything, and maybe let the society and the non-political sphere sort of act and response, because the responses from businesses and from people seem to be much more effective than those taking from the centralized authority.
Well, I'm old enough to remember the times where our life was driven by politics, and by politics designed by a single party. Those times are fortunately over, but still we live mentally in an environment that has some hesitations about non-governmental and non-profit organizations. I believe that modern democratic society has to be balanced between political and non-political or citizen activities. And the stronger civil society is, the more contribution it provides to the state, the better, because it speaks about adult democratic society. And the state shouldn't see non-governmental, non-profit organizations as an enemy, but as a valued contribution to provide full spectrum of tools and to involve population in as many activities as possible. Only then we can be successful in almost everything, because potential in harnessing capabilities of all citizens is simply immense.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to stay with the questions from the audience here. And one of the questions was, it was asked at the beginning, but it would maybe serve as a good question towards the end of this this discussion. What security issues does the coronavirus pose to the Czech Republic and our region?
I would probably say the first place is, and it's not the most important, but it's most urgent, the most visible, and it will be pressure on defense spending, on development projects within our military capabilities, because almost all the countries had to invest a lot of money into preserving their economies. All the countries will have to pump money into social programs and initiatives. And all the countries will get into troubles in sticking to their commitments when it comes to defense spending. Some people would probably expect me defending spending for the militaries at all cost. I am not, because I think we have to be very sober to understand that security is very important, but not the only concern. And of course, when we allowed social tensions to rise, then of course they probably would be one of security risks as well. So all the governments will have to balance very carefully not to weaken their security, both internal and external, but at the same time to keep their countries and societies running. So I think there is a time where even a NATO will have to come to discussion on adjusting defense spending plans, because pretending that we are able, all of us, to spend at least 2% of HDP on defense, regardless coronavirus, would simply be unrealistic. And it's not the issue of only for the Czech Republic, but for all the countries. We have to be fair, we have to be reasonable, but we have to have enough courage to open this question.
Very interesting answer. There's one more question from the audience that we cannot omit, and that is whether we will see you engage in the political activities in the Czech Republic in the future or not, asks one of our audiences.
Let me answer this question in a way that I usually do when I'm asked during my public debates. What I ask all people in Czech Republic is to be responsible citizens. And what I mean by being responsible citizen is the first place, look around to what is going on, watch carefully the issues that are affecting our lives, be responsible when it comes to the elections, going to the elections, pick up right politicians. When we elect them, to watch them in the meantime, between the elections, not to let them doing what they want, but watch them if they are doing what they promised us when we elected them. And when it comes to the top level responsibility, if anyone has a chance and the capability to get elected for the office, whichever level, people should take this responsibility, because otherwise we would only let it to those opportunistic influence seekers, and politics will always be dirty business. And when I urge my audience to do that, I cannot obviously stay aside. So I would behave as a responsible citizen when it comes to the next step, which means if there is a situation, I will be a responsible citizen.
Great. I think that's a perfect answer. Well, I think this was a fascinating debate, and I wanted to end it on sort of a high note before I hand the word to Patrick. Former chief of staff of President Obama used to say, Rahm Emanuel, he used to say that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. So my question to you is, what do you think are the silver linings that you hope that we're gonna take with us from this crisis, and what is it gonna be?
First, I would go to the citizens, because from what we saw on the side of all the initiatives, all the willingness to support, this is something that we should keep. That people are generally good. Regardless what we think about ourselves, regardless what we think about our society, there are many good people who are worth of doing something for them. Second idea would be, let's change our view when it comes to non-profit organizations. In our country, non-profit organizations are quite often marked by a number of top-level politicians as only political cover-up organizations supporting different interests. And I'm not going now to mention any name, but we can obviously imagine how easy it is to put a sticker on a non-profit organization and create a perception that is very, very negative. What these organizations are doing today is simply amazing. They are those who are at the front line, who are doing it regardless any reward. They are doing it in their own time for their own money quite often, and they take a lot of risk. Then third line would probably go to academic institutions and private companies, especially those small ones. We face now a discussion about supporting or not supporting all those little entrepreneurs who employ quite often only themselves or a couple of other people. These are the people who are the backbone of the economy. It's not the huge, big companies. It's thousands and thousands of these small entrepreneurs, and all these people should be supported because they will in the end be those who will create a strong foundation for the future. So I think if we keep these three lines, that's good enough.
Great. That's I think that's a great way to end this. I thank you very much for spending more than an hour with us. I think this was a great discussion, and with that, I hand the word back to Patrick.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and thank you as well, you, General, for this amazing debate. And I would like to as well emphasize upon your one of your current projects, Spolu silnější. So guys, if it's anyone out there who would like to contribute to something what is really meaningful and has some impact, it really makes sense to support this project. So please check it on their website. And yeah, thank you very much for your time, and looking forward for our next debate in the next week. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
you.